Ramachandra Guha, 1958, was born in Dehradun, Uttar Pradesh, now in Uttarakhand. He is a historian, academic, and biographer. He has written on various subjects such as environmental issues, cricket, history, and politics. Born into a Tamil family in Dehradun, Ramachandra was educated at the prestigious St. Stephen's College and the Delhi School of Economics. Ramachandra Guha has written columns for major Indian newspapers and has also taught at reputed universities. Some of his prominent works are India After Gandhi, A Corner of a Foreign Field, and his two-part biography on Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi Before India and Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World. He has won many national and international awards. At present, he lives in Bengaluru. The first chapter of Guha's book Environmentalism: A Global History tries to trace the history of evolution of collective consciousness about the serious environmental issues that came to fore in the mid-20th century. The chapter attempts to map the spread of the movement as an international phenomenon. Guha talks about how the growth of environmentalism is inalienably bound up with the development of other progressive movements, like democracy, socialism, and feminism. The environmental movement is a child of the 60s that has stayed its course, where other manifestations of that decade of protest pacifism, the counterculture, and the civil rights struggle have either lost out or lost their way. The green wave shows no sign of abating. The environmental movement has refused to go away and, some would say, refused to grow up, retaining the vigor and intensity but also the impatience and intolerance of an ever-youthful social movement. Alone among the movements of the 60s, it has gained steadily in power, prestige, and, what is perhaps most important, public appeal. Popular support apart, the success of the environmental movement is also reflected in the forests and wild areas it has helped set aside, as well as in the laws it has repealed or got enacted. Nowhere more effectively than in the United States of America. In this country, the pressures of environmentalists, rather than autonomous government action, have created an extensive and for the most part well-managed system of national parks, having protected large chunks of wilderness from the threat of development. The American environmental movement has increasingly turned its attention to controlling the hazardous byproducts of industrialization, air and water pollution, and the production of toxic or radioactive wastes. Here too it has been conspicuously successful, forcing Congress to enact over 70 environmental measures into law. Among these is the National Environment Protection Act of 1969, a comprehensive piece of legislation and the envy of environmentalists in other countries who struggle to enforce minimum standards on their own governments. While opinion polls consistently show over two-thirds of the public in support of even stricter environmental measures and willing to part with some hard-earned dollars in the cause, the green agenda is also influencing the outcome of local, state and federal elections. Politicians from both parties assiduously project a green image and cultivate a green constituency. It was a Republican president, George Bush, who famously remarked, "We are all environmentalists now." The Democrats, not to be outdone, sent forth as Vice President the author, Al Gore, of a respectably thorough and best-selling survey of the environmental dilemma. entitled Earth in the Balance. As the political scientist Richard Andrews points out, the influence of the environmental movement is demonstrable in all levels of government in extraordinary quantities of legislation, regulations and budgetary allocations, as well as in continuing media attention. Or as John Oakes, an editor at the New York Times, writes of the movement's most cherished achievement: the national parks are as sacred to most Americans as the flag, motherhood and apple pie. Indeed, environmentalism is by now a genuinely international movement, occurring with lesser or greater intensity in a variety of countries around the globe. Nor do these national movements necessarily work in isolation. In the age of email and the fax machine, information generated in one country can be instantaneously transmitted to another. Environmentalism has thus come to constitute a field of force in which different individuals and organizations, far removed in space, collaborate and sometimes compete in forging a movement that often transcends national boundaries. As a program of political reform, articulating concrete policies for states and societies to adopt, environmentalism needs to be distinguished from a more narrow aesthetic or scientific appreciation of the natural world. Classical literary traditions manifest an abiding concern with natural landscapes in writing of the beauty of birds, animals, rivers and farms. Both the Roman poet Virgil c. 70 to 1 BC and the Sanskrit dramatist Kalidasa c. AD 375 to 415 would qualify as nature lovers moving on to the late Middle Ages. The exploration by European travelers of Asia and the Americas also kindled a keen interest in the richness and diversity of nature. The exuberance of plant and animal life in the tropics was documented by a whole array of European scientists, of whom the Englishman Charles Darwin, 1809 to 82, is perhaps the best known and most influential. However, as understood in this book, environmentalism goes beyond the literary appreciation of landscapes and the scientific analysis of species. I argue that environmentalism must be viewed as a social program, a charter of action which seeks to protect cherished habitats, protest against their degradation, and prescribe less destructive technologies and lifestyles. When then did the environmental movement begin? Most accounts of the American movement date its beginnings to Rachel Carson's book on pesticide pollution, Silent Spring, published in 1962 and variously described as the Bible and founding event of modern environmentalism. It is true that it is only in the 60s that environmentalism emerges as a popular movement successfully influencing public policy through a mixture of protest in the streets and the lobbying of legislators in the corridors of power. However, an intellectual concern for the protection or conservation of nature goes back at least to the last decades of the 18th century. This precocious interest rapidly grew in the 19th century, its votaries seeking to influence the modernizing governments of North America and Europe, without always commanding a mass base. This earlier generation of environmentalists initiated wide-ranging programs of forest and water conservation and also helped set up the first national parks. The history of environmentalism in most countries has followed a broadly similar pattern. An early period of pioneering and prophecy, culminating in recent decades, in a widespread social movement. We might thus speak of a first wave of environmentalism, the initial response to the onset of industrialization, and a second wave when a largely intellectual response was given shape and force by a groundswell of public support. Environmentalism thus has a rather longer and more distinguished lineage than is sometimes allowed for. In its contemporary forms, it is certainly a child of the 1960s, but also, as this book shows, perhaps a grandchild of the 1860s. The first wave of environmentalism proceeded step by step with the Industrial Revolution, itself the most far-reaching process of social change in human history. The industrialization of the world dramatically altered the natural world through new methods of resource extraction, production, and transportation. The scale and intensity at which nature was used and abused increased manifold. Simultaneously, advances in medical technology led to a steady increase in human populations. More humans producing more and consuming more led axiomatically to greater pollution and habitat degradation. The pace of environmental destruction greatly accelerated. Nature became a source of cheap raw material as well as a sink for dumping the unwanted residues of economic growth. Open-cast mining and the ever-growing appetite of industry decimated forests and wildlands. New and dangerous chemicals were excreted into rivers and the atmosphere. The industrialization of Europe led also to major changes in the rural economy. The factories and cities needed materials to process and consume. These demands leading to a transformation of agriculture through the adoption of more capital-intensive, market-oriented methods of production. Pastures and hedgerows and small farms with mixed crops gave way to a more monotonous landscape of large, continuous holdings dominated by crop monocultures. Further afield, European economic growth also impacted the natural environments of Asia, Africa, and North America. Industrialization had an organic connection with imperial expansion, as white colonists took possession of large parts of the globe, reorienting local economies towards the demands of the metropolis. British ships were built of Burma teak, their sailors wearing clothes of cotton grown in India, drinking Kenyan coffee sweetened with sugar planted in the Caribbean, decimating the forests of northeastern United States, Southern Africa, and the Western Ghats of India, to name only three such regions the British were. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, unquestionably the world leaders in deforestation, emulating them in lesser or greater degree, were the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, the Belgians, and the Germans. European powers who were to all become prime agents of ecological destruction in their colonies. Environmental problems were certainly not unknown in the past. But possibly for the first time in human history there was now the perception of an environmental crisis. This was the perception seized upon by the first wave of environmentalism, which asked whether the great increases in wealth and prosperity brought about by modern industrialization were in fact sustainable. Notably, while the industrial city was the prime generator of ecological degradation, much of the burden of this degradation was felt in the country and the colony, as we shall see in this book. In the vanguard of the first wave of environmentalism were residents of the countryside, such as William Wordsworth, as well as unwilling subjects of colonialism, such as Mohandas Karamchand Mahatma Gandhi. As a dynamic social response to the Industrial Revolution, environmentalism bears comparison with three other movements of the modern world: democracy, socialism, and feminism. Defined in opposition to absolutism, democracy calls for a greater voice of ordinary citizens in decisions that affect their lives. Defined in opposition to both feudalism and capitalism, socialism calls for a more equitable distribution of wealth and productive resources. Defined in opposition to patriarchy, feminism calls for the granting of greater political and economic rights to women. Meanwhile, the environmental movement has expanded human understandings of rights and justice, calling for greater attention to the rights of nature as well as for sustainable lifestyles. Its agenda has sometimes been complementary to the agendas of other movements at other times, in competition with them. These connections between environmentalism on the one side and democracy, socialism or feminism on the other, shall become explicit as one's understanding of these issues grows. Like all social movements, the environmental movement has within its fold different individuals, trends, traditions, and ideologies. Just as there are varieties of feminism, there have been varieties of environmentalism as well. The three such varieties of environmentalism may be summarized in the following manner. 1. We have, first of all, the moral and cultural critique of the Industrial Revolution, here termed back to the land, for the great romantic poets like Blake and Wordsworth. The dark, satanic mills of the industrial age threatened to obliterate forever their green and pleasant land. The pastoral idyll of rural and traditional England. Novelists like Charles Dickens and political thinkers like Frederick Engels wrote critically of the inhuman working and living conditions of the time, the bleak homes and the dark, damp and polluting factories. Others, like the Indian saint politician Mahatma Gandhi, combined a moral critique with a simple lifestyle, living gently on the earth while deploring the multiplication of wants that modern civilization had brought about. 2. The second strand, that of scientific conservation, chose not to turn its back on industrial society, but to work instead on taming its excesses, based on careful research in the empirical mode, rather than on a purely artistic or affective response. This variety of environmentalism argued that without careful guidance by experts, industrialization would rapidly use up resources and pollute the environment. Conservation was the gospel of efficiency, the use of science to manage nature and natural resources efficiently and in the long run. Crucial here is the idea of sustained yield, the belief that human use of fish or forest, water or wildlife should not dip into the capital stock, restricting itself to the annual increment of the resource in question. By the late 19th century, scientific conservation had emerged as a global movement, with foresters taking the lead in establishing resource management agencies run on scientific lines in Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. 3. The third strand of environmentalism, which combines elements of morality, science, and aesthetics, is what has come to be known as the wilderness idea. The industrialization of Europe and the settlement and spread of European populations in the New World devastated large areas of forest and wilderness. There arose in response a movement of artists and scientists which aimed to lock up areas still untouched, to keep them free of human disturbance. Sometimes the motivation was the protection from extinction of endangered species like the grizzly bear. At other times the saving of scenic habitats like Yosemite, although it has its outposts in other corners too. The wilderness movement has flowered most vibrantly in the United States.